Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second PSG event of 2024. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Rachel Thompson and Hannah Laws from Iron Mountain, who are going to take us through the next hour. But just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we're set up so that we can't unmute people to ask questions themselves. So if you can put your questions in the chat, and Hannah will be monitoring those to see the best place to actually have those answered. You please feel free to make comments or have conversations in the chat, but as always, I would ask you to keep those constructive and professional, please, although I know I really don't need to say that to this group. Without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Rachel and Hannah, who will take us through the next hour.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, folks. Good to see so many of you on the call today. So as you know, Hannah and I, we're going to be walking you through kind of addressing the long-term impacts of a rapid transition to hybrid working. So we know over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of change to the ways that we work. And so essentially today we're kind of investigating how we take a little bit of a step back, review those changes that have happened, and hopefully how we can kind of address some of the bigger risks and issues that we see. So just as a little bit of a summary of what we're doing, so we'll do a quick little intro so you know a little bit more about who we are. And then we're going to be, as I say, walking through bit by bit these different capabilities and how we can assess each of these areas to make sure we've got a holistic view of what's happening at our organisation. As Elizabeth mentioned, Hannah's going to keep an eye on the questions, so if she sees any that we think we should answer as we go through, she'll let me know. But otherwise, we'll also leave space at the end to answer those questions. If we do run out of time, which hopefully we won't, again, after this call, we'll make sure that we've addressed all of those questions that have come up in one way or another. So if we do miss you in some way, please don't worry. We'll keep a record of that one. Excuse me. So our introductions to start. So Hannah and myself are obviously at Iron Mountain. I am a senior consultant within our information governance team. Prior to this, I've worked at a fair few different places, including things like JP Morgan, Deloitte, KPMG. So quite financial services based, but I've also done my time at Hackney Council and things like that. So I've got quite a good view of industries. And so hopefully I can share kind of some of that knowledge and experience and you can pick my brains a little bit today. Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone, and apologies in advance for any background noise. This is a true long-term impact of hybrid working. I'm traveling, moving around today, so I'm in a coffee shop and it's rather noisy, so apologize in advance. But yeah, so thanks Rachel. I'm Hannah Laws. I'm principal consultant in our information governance professional services, working with Rachel and our team in the UK, covering our European region. I've got over 18 years experience working in various different information risk management, information governance roles, a lot of experience in financial services, but more recently across all different sectors, including public sector. So yeah, I'm going to hand back to Rachel in a second. She's going to take you through our slides today into the content, and I'll chip in with some questions and some polls that we've got to keep everyone wide awake, hopefully. Just to also say that yeah, I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get everyone's questions out there. So over to you, Rachel. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay, perfect. So without further ado, we'll dive straight in. So today, essentially, what we're going to structure this kind of assessment approach around are these kind of 6 key areas. So we'll be looking a little bit into kind of the governance and strategy at an organisation, and then kind of going clockwise round, we'll be looking a little bit around operating models and how we should set those up, setting the roles and responsibilities. We'll touch on the policy framework, so making sure we've got, you know, those good, strong frameworks in place to support the organisation and everyone understands their expectations. We'll look at controls and risk management. So how do we identify those controls and how do we manage them in order to support kind of that risk management and issue identification. We'll also take a look at tools and technologies. So this isn't just about looking at new tools, but also what tools do we have existing in the organization already that we can leverage and use a bit more effectively. And then one of my favorites on there, change management. So not just the training and awareness, but really how are we winning the hearts and minds of our organization and making sure that people are always on board with this journey that we're on. Okay, so in this section on the governance and strategy, we're also going to do a Slido question. So I'll press play on that one in a bit, but you've got the question there that you can start thinking about. And there's also the QR code. So if you just scan the QR code, it should bring that up on your phones. And hopefully then you'll be able to see that. Okay, so as I talked through then, so governance and strategy. So we know that as everyone moved kind of to home working, initially kind of during that kind of COVID period, and then now moving much more into that hybrid working situation, a lot of governance and oversight processes were expedited. So we took quite a few shortcuts as organizations to make sure that people had, you know, the tools, the resources, the information and knowledge that they needed in order to be able to, you know, keep on working, keep businesses moving. And so at this stage, now that things are kind of settling in and we're moving much more into that real hybrid working world, although it feels like we're also getting much more pressure to move almost 100% back to the office in some cases. But it's a really good idea now to kind of take that step back and have a look at, you know, what are the governance processes that exist now? Did anybody take on some additional responsibilities that perhaps weren't recorded or documented? You know, and that can be both a positive and a negative thing. Perhaps there's activities that are happening behind the scenes that we don't have any oversight of that might be problematic. But equally, maybe there's people within the organization who really stepped up and started to kind of take control of some of these risks within the business. And now it's really good time to kind of formalize that and make sure that they are, you know, that we're aware of that they're in place and people know to kind of report things to those people. So initially with governance and strategy, I would say here, so I'm just kind of talking through these points here. So, you know, track where those decisions have been made and really try and formalize that into a governance structure that can be leveraged. So, you know, were there any new executive groups that were built up and that you can now use in order to escalate those issues and, you know, change your own information records management processes? So it includes those people. Operating committees and working groups, again, were any creative? Did you lose any? And now actually you've got some, you know, issues, some gaps where there's a break in the escalation chain. So someone's got an issue, they've noted the risk, but actually they don't know where to report it, or they're reporting it to someone and then no action is ever taken. So is that oversight in place? So yeah, identifying if there's any gaps in the oversight process, as I said there. And then the last point there, reviewing and updating your strategy. So as an organization, do you have a formalized strategy document? And does it still meet the aims and objectives of the organization? We know that through COVID, some of the organization strategy may have changed. Your approach may be much more about being able to provide effective remote services, whereas previously they were much more in person. So does your information management strategy meet that? Do people have the information, the data that they need to hand? But also, are there any organizational goals for implementing much more around kind of AI, automation? Is your business trying to move a little bit more towards, you know, adopting cloud technologies in order to make information more available wherever anybody is? And again, you know, data cleansing. Are you now starting to look at, there's a lot of information here that we need to investigate, that we need to remove, in order to make the data quality much more effective for people and, you know, what they're using. So I think being able to take that step back and make sure that as a records management department, you're still very much aligned to the organization and where they want to go. and that your approach really supports people and enables them to, you know, take on those new goals. So quick run through on that one. So I think now if we go over to the Slido, the question there for you is going to be, do you feel that your organization has appropriate governance in place for approving and monitoring data processing activities? So kind of keep in mind what we've talked through there. I'm just swapping screens here to press play on that. So
and just while you're doing that, Rachel, yeah, just while you're doing that, and whilst people are thinking about questions and they're starting to answer, I can give a real life example where quite recently we've been supporting a critical national infrastructure company organization who were, you know, massively impacted by COVID and actually halved their workforce. So when they came back afterwards and started to rebuild the business, they, you know, really struggled. They'd lost a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise in the business. A lot of roles had been furloughed and had disappeared. So when they came back, they were, you know, really unsure of their governance strategy and really had to kind of start again. So we've helped them reassess where they were on their journey and what they need to do to identify the biggest risks that they're facing now, given the impacts that COVID has had on them.
Perfect. Okay, so it looks like we've got some of those results coming in, and I think, Hannah, you'd agree this is a fairly typical response that we get, that, you know, lots of people, you've got those governance processes in place, but it needs a little bit of tweaking, perhaps that formalization we've talked about. It's fantastic to see most of you have got there's a good chunk of you there with some great processes in place that you feel, you know, quite confident in. And then the small percentage on the bottom there, which is, no, we definitely need to work on it. And sometimes that's just about trying to find, you know, the right people, creating those networks a little bit more, and really trying to kind of push on that one. I think if you kind of in that no section, it can be a lot harder to find those appropriate people. And so trying to develop, you know, a business case for strengthening these activities and getting it in front of the right people is very important. Okay, perfect. I am going to stop that one now then. Thank you very much. Great. So then back to our presentation. So then moving through then into the operating model side of things. So again, as we said here, during rapid unplanned change, it's really likely that employees are taking on new or additional responsibilities. So we talked about this a little bit around the governance and strategy, but this is much more about the roles and responsibilities that actually sit within the business. So, you know, whether we're calling them data stewards, record champions, privacy professionals, you know, there's a few different roles that sometimes we create within the organization. And with all the change that's been happening, you might find that there's also a lot of people who have taken on a lot of informal roles. So, you know, perhaps if you've got hard copy storage, there's someone who's kind of been nominated within a business to manage that, but perhaps don't have a formal title, or it's not documented within their own job description and things like that. So I think it's really important to be able to have a look at the whole business and find out where these people are, because they're, you know, they really are your champions. They're the people who are going to be on your side. So being able to kind of recognize them and document what those roles and responsibilities are is quite important. And again, it might be that actually during all of that change, new functions within the business have opened up as well, new areas, new departments that have been created to address very specific problems. So again, taking that view of trying to, you know, map out what does my organization look like now, where are those key people, is absolutely vital. So at this stage, I think it's really good if you have a documented operating model already to have a good review of that one. Or if you don't, then kind of working to try and define an operating model, which includes kind of those guiding principles for information and records management. You know, if you are to, you know, do your top 5 of why information and records management is important and the approach that we want to take, you know, that's a really good start to set out that document and your intention for it. We've talked about this as well, the governance and the interaction model. So where are issues being escalated to? Where is it being reported to? But also from the top down, where is that strategy sitting, and who's driving all of this program? As we said, documenting those roles and responsibilities is important, but also the technology tools and systems that you're using. We do talk a little bit more about technology later on in this presentation, but for now, within an operating model, being able to identify, your key systems of record. Where is it that you want your information, your data to be stored and primarily accessed from? And understanding that you can manage the access on that, the data quality, and just making sure that as an organization, it's clearly documented which tools and technology you should be using as a primary focus. So yeah, hopefully that helps you to think a little bit more about your operating model. And again, we're going over to Slido for a quick question there around, does your organization currently have a documented operating model that clearly defines information management expectations for the organization?
And again, I'll just chip in whilst you're switching over and people are responding. So on the same example, the same client that we worked with, and in one of the interesting things that they decided to do is, as well as a new operating model and new roles and responsibilities around information governance, that they aligned the goals and the needs from an information management perspective to the organization's more strategic goals. And they actually captured that in people's job descriptions and in their targets, so that everyone felt that there was accountability for some aspect of information management within their own roles. So we obviously see that when it's somebody's specific role, but even in other roles in the organization, they've started to put that into their balanced scorecard and into their achievement results. So that's a really interesting step that some organizations have considered and are taking.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay, so at the moment, it's looking like we've got a very even split on the responses here. So again, I guess I from my experience, I'm used to there being everyone in a much more sort of, it's a work in progress phase where, lots of people have documented those key points that are important to them, but they're realizing that either the operating model as a document either isn't very well promoted at the business, so there's not much awareness of it, or that it's lacking a certain amount of strength and definition in there. So I think working on your operating model is really helpful as well, because it's a really good tool for you to constantly refer back to around kind of, well, what is our goal? What is it that we want to look like as an organization? How do we want our records management function to operate across the whole business? So it's a really nice centralized document to have and for people to kind of work from and chip into. Okay, so I'm going to stop that one and then move back to our presentation. We have one more Slido later on at the end, so that's good. Okay, so then kind of the next stage in doing that bit of an assessment for your organization to understand, what's changed over the last few years is, again, having a review of that policy framework. So we know that as everyone quickly moved to home working, with all of these rapid changes, the policies, the standards, the procedures that we had at the organization weren't necessarily updated, or if they were done really rapidly. Again, things were perhaps signed off where they shouldn't have been, or were pushed through without much consideration for whether they would be effective over the long term. So, there was a lot of that kind of very reactive short-term thinking of how do we make a policy that works for people now, that gives them the direction and the understanding they need to manage their information, their records safely and securely in our current state. But I think because there was a lot of, it wasn't clear what the long-term working approach would be, we've not necessarily gone back to review those policies and those changes. We're just kind of working to them still. So this is a really good time to kind of reflect on any organizational changes, any cultural changes, and really developing a policy that, you know, not only supports kind of the legal and regulatory expectations, but also supports the business. And it really sets an example for how we want our teams, or, you know, our employees to be working and managing that information and data. So kind of 4 key aspects we've identified here. So looking at, does the current information management policy reflect the way your business operates, as well as supporting the legal and regulatory expectations? Is the policy supported by appropriate standards and procedures that help provide clear direction to employees? So typically we'd like to see a policy document that is quite short, quite high level, quite punchy, and just has those really important policy statements about how the organization works and is, you know, the kind of the real meat of what is compliance for the organization. And then having those underpinning standards that provide a little bit more direction of how the business should be meeting those policy statements. So providing a bit more detail perhaps around the systems that they have to use for certain activities, or the processes that they must be following for certain activities. And then again, that step down, looking at procedures. So procedures will be developed much more in the business and probably based off those standards, but making sure people understand that when it comes to the information that they're using, the data that they're using, that those procedures are in line with the business expectations. And so, you know, as records managers or within your roles, you may not necessarily have much oversight of procedures, maybe the occasional review here, or perhaps an issue is being flagged up. But you know that because you've got your policy and your effective standards, the procedures should also be compliant and provide clear directions to employees. Next, it's important to have a look at whether those policies and the procedures, as well as the standards, have the appropriate level of sign-off and senior support. So it might be that, again, with people, you know, joining, moving, leaving the organization, the senior management that used to sign off these policies has changed, or the people responsible are different. Perhaps there's new roles that have come in that would be much more effective at overseeing some of these kind of policy framework issues. So again, taking that step back, reviewing if there's any organizational changes is really important. And then kind of back to that communication side of things, are business areas aware of any updates? And are the business areas also implementing those changes? Are they running effectively? And we do talk a little bit as well around in this later on, you know, what controls are in place? How are you monitoring that there's effective implementation? So yeah, hopefully that gives you some really good pointers for kind of looking at that whole policy framework and making something that's quite cohesive and holistic as well. So really good for the business. Perfect. And then if we move on to the next one. So as I said, we were going to touch on controls and risk management. So same, through all of the change that we've had, we've perhaps got some old controls in place that aren't working as well as they should be, or new ones are, you know, popping up all the time that perhaps we don't have oversight of or aren't working effectively. So being able to try and map out what information and records management controls are across the business is really important. It might be that controls within your business are currently managed by things like your technology team. So interacting with different departments is quite important to understand, you know, what controls are in place. You know, it's not just the ones that perhaps your area of the business has created, but what is everyone else doing as well? And, you know, identifying where those information risks sit within the business would also be a good way to start identifying those controls. So if there's a risk present, is there a control present for that risk? So on here, as we said, key controls could include, hopefully, I think we've all got DPIAs in place, so those data privacy impact assessments, but not just around personal data. What about any other general data use assessments? So if someone's going to be running a project or buying in a new piece of software or something like that, are the controls and assessments in place for them before they actually start using the organization's data? So, you know, we're not just looking at the sensitive or the legal and regulatory required information. We want to look at how the business is using that data as a whole. Touched on this a bit before as well, use of those authoritative data system sources or the system of record. So have you got documented, you know, are there controls in place to say that actually the data that you're using for a certain project has to come from a certain system because it is the original source? And obviously that will then help with the organization's data quality, and you know that you're using the correct information. Then also things like access controls. Do the right people have access to the right data? I think we're all familiar with having to run assessments on who's got access in what systems and trying to persuade people to review those access rights. So again, making sure that those are in place as well. Then the next aspect I'd move on to here is, you know, is there a control framework for the implementation of management and controls? And do you have a view of the controls that impact your information management? So again, it might be somewhere else in the business. They've got a fantastic controls framework that you do or don't know about, but being able to, you know, review all of those controls and highlight that, you know, which ones are important to you, which ones impact information, which ones impact data, and being able to keep an eye on those. It just helps kind of see, you know, you to see the view of your business and to understand if any of those controls are either outdated or ineffective, or again, as we said, just not quite right for the culture of the business or the goals of the business. Then do you have monitoring and reporting activities in place to identify and remediate any issues? So if your controls fail, how do you get notified? Do you get notified? What's that escalation channel? And if there is an issue and it's been escalated, are they being effectively remediated? You know, sometimes things are escalated and they just disappear off somewhere. So, you know, going back to that kind of governance structure, are the right people in the right place to make sure risks and issues are remediated? So doing some ad hoc testing of controls, doing audits of business areas, and generally confirming those governance structures are working effectively is really important. And we'll give you that idea of, you know, in the new working environment, you know, is everything fit for purpose? And then lastly on this one, can you track the impacts to data from your information management activities? So again, you know, is there, you know, improved data quality from implementing these controls? Do you get a good view on what data and information is being shared, who's using it, things like that across the business as well? So having the right controls and the risk management in place should also give you a good view of how information and data is moving around your organization.
I'll just add there, sometimes we see, you know, organisations do have some of this in place, but it's more on a best efforts and a best endeavours, because they're, you know, constantly firefighting potentially incidents and issues that are occurring, and getting that holistic overview and that good governance to manage everything is not always possible. But you know, we do reinforce the importance of prioritising this as a control and risk management framework.
Thanks, Hannah. Right, and then onto tools and technology, the bane of many of our lives. We know that our organisations like to adopt different tools and technologies without necessarily telling all the appropriate people. And I think, you know, lockdowns, moving to 100% home working and then moving to hybrid is, you know, it's always going to be a really good example of where businesses took on lots of new tools, lots of new ideas that had a really big impact on the business. You know, some of it was really positive. It really, you know, sped up that process for getting the right tools, the right oversight, the right compliance, and everyone kind of getting on board with a single purpose. But then on the other side of it, a lot of businesses took on, you know, tools and technology that use data perhaps not in ways that we would like them to. So being able to kind of take that step back and review that those tools, the technologies, the systems that we're using are genuinely fit for purpose. You know, does it meet our operating model? Does it meet the policy framework? Is it in line with the organization's expectations of how, you know, their data is used? You know, that's a really important question to ask around, you know, is it right? But it's also not just about looking at, is it fit for purpose? But it may be, as I said, some fantastic tools were brought on. Can you leverage those tools more effectively? You know, most organizations have had SharePoint in for a very long time. And actually, there can be some great records management functionality within that. Are you getting the most that you can out of those tools and systems? It might be as well with the move to kind of, like I said, clients and customers using much more, you know, online or virtual contact points. Perhaps there's new technology to capture the information recorded within those systems. You know, have you got oversight of that? Do you have kind of that technology asset register as well that tells you, great, this is all of the assets that we're using. Perhaps these ones process data, perhaps these ones store data, and just knowing where everything is very important. So kind of as part of looking at your tools and technology as well, this is a really good time to start putting together almost like a technology strategy and roadmap. So where is it that the organization wants to go? What are their information management goals and ambitions? We often see there's a lot of conversation now around, you know, automated intelligence, just automating in general, moving to the cloud for different purposes. And I think as records managers, we're often very reactive to that. We've not necessarily had time to review what is, you know, effective and compliant for the organization from an information management perspective. So being able to kind of take that step back and say, well, actually, which direction is the organization going in? Which new and emerging technologies do we think are going to impact us? And how can we just get a few kind of clear statements around our approach to that new technology can just be really important. It might not be the answers, but at least you've got kind of this strategy that you're working to and that you understand is important. Perfect. So now we're going to head back over to Slido for our last test of that system. So on this one, we thought it might just be interesting for all of you to see a little bit around what tools, technology and systems you're using to manage your information. So I'm expected to see a lot of things like SharePoint, but, you know, are there any other tools and systems that you think are processing data or holding data that, you know, you're aware of, and that might be quite interesting to kind of share that you're using those things. So here we go. Yeah, Microsoft 365. Lots of SharePoint. And I think this is really great as well, because, you know, we start to see where you need a little bit more kind of support and information as well. It helps us to direct our help. So yeah, this is fantastic. And hopefully it's nice for you to see what everyone else is popping up on here as well. So yeah, Zoom, lots of kind of communication software and things like that there. Yeah, HR. So it's really broad, huge things here. I think the other thing that's important to note when we start seeing all of these different tools and systems is how connected is your business? Do these tools integrate and talk with each other? And so being able to get a bit of a seat at that IT table as well to say, well, we're seeing a lot of use of these specific tools. How do we embed a bit more records management, you know, capability, functionality into these? How do we get them talking to each other? So yeah, creating kind of that strategy and that future vision of what you'd like, you know, information management to look like in your business can just be really good for getting everybody on the same page. And of course, we all have to be flexible. It might be that somewhere else in the business, they've already got a technology strategy. So how do you build, those information management needs into what exists already?
And in a perfect world, we'd all like to be involved before these tools are onboarded and, have our seat at that table as well. But it's not always the case. And particularly, that's obviously what happened with COVID and post-COVID, and, the rapid integration or implementation of some of these additional tools, and now having to retrospectively risk assess, from an information management point of view, what the risks are, what the controls need to be put in place. And that's so important, and it's still a worthwhile, obviously, thing to do after the event, if at any point, if at all possible. So it goes back to your other points earlier in the presentation, Rachel.
All right, perfect. So thanks for sharing that. Really, really useful. Let me go back to my little slideshow. Here we go. And then, as I said, the last and probably one of my favorite aspects of these kind of assessments is the change management. So that the hearts and minds of our organizations. So as we say there, we know the move to remote and hybrid working was rapid. Not all change was effectively managed, and not all change made people happy. And I think that's one of the reasons why I kind of like this aspect of change management, is because it's really important to try and take people along with you when there is massive change happening. We can all feel very resistant to change when we don't really understand what's changing, why it's changing, what the purpose is. And so it's really important to kind of reflect on why people might be resistant, because if they're not brought along and they're not correctly informed, they will develop quirky habits. They'll find workarounds, they'll find ways to foil your best intentions. So yeah, kind of re-engaging with the business a little bit more to, understand, what are their issues, what's frustrating them, and how can you help? I think for a long time, at the start of my career as a record manager, I felt like my job was simply to tell people no. But of course, that's not true. We're there to, enable people and make sure the business is doing as well as it can. And this is a really important part of that. So I would say, even backtracking a little bit to manage changes that have already happened is quite important. So, these points here: plan change management activities are part of any new updates or implementations, or perhaps things that have happened, 6, 9, 12 months ago that you think is worth a revisit to get people a little bit more on board and a bit more engaged. And in terms of those kind of change management activities, like I said, are you consulting people? Are you running awareness sessions? Are you helping people to kind of almost own the changes themselves, that they want to be on board and they want to drive these changes that you're working through and that you want to implement as well? Reviewing the training that you have, or creating new training that's adequate for all employees. So put on there kind of the joiners, the movers, and the leavers. Organizations often have quite a high turnover now. You have people moving around within the business. The training that they've had in one location might not necessarily be adequate for their new role. But also existing employees, perhaps they've not had any training for the last 12, 18 months, or since they started their job. Roles change, and the things that they have to do with information, data, and records, that's changing a lot as well. So being able to keep that up to date, keep them engaged, keep them aware is important. Again, it can be very difficult because there's obviously a lot of training sessions that run through our business, and it's taking time out of people's day. So perhaps as you're doing your own mandated training, as with your organization, you can find little bits here and there just to nudge in a bit about information management, so it keeps it in people's minds and they're aware that they need to be doing a bit more to think about the information they're using and spotting any risks that they might see along the way and escalating those appropriately. And then the last one there, any additional training or awareness activities that are planned to keep employees engaged. So like I said, it might just be that you feel like you've not spoken to people for a while, or you're losing a bit of track of how people, you know, feel about those new information management policies that you've just released. So making sure, you know, you've got a little bit of a plan for what's going to be disseminated around the organization.
We had a comment in the chat earlier, Rachel, when you were talking about governance and strategy, and the fact that, you know, it's great to have clearly defined governance and policies and procedures, but the challenge is more about getting people to do those things, to mirror those expectations and actually do it in their day jobs. So I think this is a really, you know, one of the answers to that problem and to that issue is this whole, you know, change management training and awareness in hearts and minds, and bringing in a culture. What do you want the culture to be? What are your more strategic goals? If you're a data driven organization, and you rely on data to make decisions and to serve your customers and the public, then, you know, data is important to everyone, and getting that understanding and getting that culture into your organization. And it might be, like I said earlier, by putting it into people's balanced scorecards, into people's goals, as part of that as well. So I think this is a really good point to pick up there. It wasn't so much a question, but a comment.
No, and I think that's a really important point to make. I've certainly sat within organizations where, you know, we've updated policies at one point what felt like a weekly basis. I'm sure it wasn't for the business, but I certainly felt like I had been churning through updates to this policy again and again. So I think just, you know, making sure, like Hannah says, that you know what the culture is, you know what the expectation is, you know what you're trying to create, so that when you write that policy, it doesn't change again. And I think that means that people aren't, you know, they're not worn out by change either. You know, you've set that emotion, and that is a clear direction for a really good amount of time. Okay, perfect. So that brings us to the end. So I think just to kind of summarize there as well. So we've kind of created that, hopefully like a little bit of a step-by-step approach, so you can kind of work through these capabilities yourselves and take that away to try and give yourself a bit of a view around the organization in a structured way. We will be sharing these slides as well, so you've got it in your back pocket, and of course, you know, if you're kind of working through this sort of assessment and you need some help, then, you know, just reach out to us. And we always love a good conversation around this topic. We've been in the industry a long time, we must love it. So yeah, Hannah, any other questions that you wanted to raise or talk through?
We've not had any come through, but I'll just give it a minute or so. So if people have got something burning they were thinking about, or even just a comment or any feedback on the session, or what you'd like to potentially see at another session, any ideas or topics, so anything like that, you can throw them in the chat. We'd love to hear about any ideas. I don't know if you just want to give it 30 seconds to see if anything pops in. Otherwise, we'll bring it to an end.
Absolutely, and I'll make sure our email addresses are on this as well, so people can always ping us after the session if there's anything specific that they'd like to work through.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, nothing's coming through, so I'll hand back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Rachel and Hannah for sharing their expertise with us. That was a hugely fascinating presentation, and I'm sure that people will take a little while to unpack everything that you've raised today. It's all been brilliantly good, solid stuff for people to be able to use in the public sector. As we've said, that the recording and the slides will be available afterwards. It does take a little while to get anything, the things up onto the into the RMS environment at the moment, because obviously it's all being done by volunteers, so we have to wait for gaps in the schedule for people to be able to especially edit the recording. So if in the meantime you'd like access to either the slides or the recording as a matter of urgency, then please do email me on the address that I've put up for Charlene earlier. And I popped in the chat when our next event is, which is coming up fairly soon. And Scott Salmons is going to be talking about AI and the impact on public sector records management. And obviously he's spoken about this for the last 2 years, and things are now moving apace. So it will be very interesting to see what he has to offer us on that occasion. But for now, once again, huge thank you to Hannah and Rachel for sharing their time and expertise with us. We really appreciate it. The group relies on the generosity of our speakers in giving their time and expertise to inform the group. And I hope that everybody has a pleasant afternoon and a good weekend when it comes. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.